So for today's video, we're going to talk to one of my former students, someone who at one point had been a liberal and then became a libertarian and now is kind of leaning more in the liberal direction again. We're going to talk to him about his political evolution on today's video. So stay with us. So for those of you who are new, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a college professor, and this is one of my students we're going to be talking to today. But if you share my concerns about the direction our country is taking, then maybe if you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, and maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So for today, I want to do something different. We're going to spend some time talking with my former student, Rob Butler. He's a filmmaker and a business person from here in Michigan. He has some great experiences, and I think that his views have evolved both as he's learned more about economics and more about politics, and he's gotten more involved in the real world and kind of seen how things work. And so we want to talk today about his experiences, finding out about politics and economics and working in business, and also find out a little bit about his filmmaking, which is always fun. So with that, Rob, I'd like you to meet our audience here.
Thank you for having me, Michael. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, it's great. It's great to have you, and I appreciate you taking the time. So first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about your political evolution? I mean, you started out as a liberal, as I understand, kind of an independent liberal, then evolved to become more of a libertarian. In fact, when I was teaching you, I remember you were a supporter of Ron Paul's and other libertarians, and even talked about a return to the gold standard. And I always enjoyed hearing your views because they were you were very opinionated and well-informed, but that has evolved since then. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your political history.
Yes, actually, the very first election I ever voted in was in 2000. It was, the infamous Bush-Gore election. I actually ended up voting for Ralph Nader. I didn't like either candidate, and I always had this anti-establishment type of mind state. I always questioned things. I didn't like some of the Tipper Gore stuff and the censorship with the music then. That was very off-putting, especially when you're 18 years old. So Ralph Nader was my very first candidate, and then I saw what happened with George W. Bush. He got elected. It was really disastrous those first 4 years, getting us into a unnecessary war. I was very much against the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. I still am very much against a lot of unnecessary wars unless we really need to, like World War II was justified. But I saw in 2004 it was really no other choice. We had to get Bush out, so I voted for John Kerry, and I started opening up more to the Democratic Party. Then that brought up Barack Obama, and then I started really disliking some of the policies, the foreign policy interventions. I saw a lot of the same type of policies with Bush and Obama, and then that led me to supporting Ron Paul, who was very much for civil liberties and at the time against the wars and interventions and whatnot. So I started gravitating more to libertarian thinking, and I was a staunch Gary Johnson supporter in 2016. I started opening up to their ideas, and it wasn't just till the last 4 years I started even questioning those ideas, because there's so much propaganda out there, and I started doing more and more research out there, and I'm like, no, we actually need a functional government. Even last year with COVID should prove to anybody just what could happen when everything's so laissez-faire.
Right. Well, I mean, you're not alone in terms of voting for Ralph Nader. In fact, a lot of research has shown that pretty much the difference between Al Gore winning and Al Gore getting the result that happened in Florida were really Ralph Nader votes. So, certainly you're not alone. And I think a lot of people shared your experience of seeing what happened as a result of that.
Yes, Ralph Nader, very idealistic, and
Sure.
I think a lot of the stuff he says ended up becoming quite true and resonates on a very historical level. But at the end of the day, voting for him, I felt led to Bush. In many ways, voting third party ended up going to Trump in the end too, because we saw how disastrous his administration was the last 4 years.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, actually, in the 2016 election, as I recall, didn't Gary Johnson basically say, well, maybe vote for Hillary Clinton because we don't want to see Trump elected? As I recall, he was kind of, I wouldn't say waffling on that issue, but it wasn't like he was saying 100%, we need to vote libertarian in this election. Am I right about that?
I know Bill Weld, the VP, certainly had that sympathy. I know he came out and was quite concerned once it got more closer, and then we saw what happened with the electoral college. And I will say the last 4 years of Trump's did even more damage than 8 years of Bush, with
Yes, for sure.
even without our Iraq war.
For sure, for sure. Well, let's talk about the situation with the international interventions here, because that seems to be really a central driver of a lot of what your what has kind of informed your views here. How do you feel about the fact now that I just was reading today about how they're closing down the Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, and of course, we just did a bombing on the border of Syria and Iraq and Iran, and it seems like that's kind of getting riled up again. How do you feel about the way things are going with our foreign policy right now?
Basically, it's more of the same. It is quite liberating to see us get out of Afghanistan. We've needed to get
I
out of
mean, that's the
there.
longest war the country has ever engaged in.
Yeah, we should have been out of there within a couple of years. It was really unnecessary. There's a lot of people that profit off of war. There always has been. There always will be. And I do fear. Yeah, we're ending this war. We're getting them out, but we could possibly find ourselves in another war. But now we're kind of seeing a lot of technology change. We're seeing more drone strikes. Like even under President Obama, we saw 5 more wars. And a lot of those wars were mostly by drones and airstrikes. So we could, and plus we also have cyber warfare. That's probably going to be our next new war that we're going to gravitate in as well, which is
Yeah,
quite
and
a
that can
lot.
be that could be very damaging. I mean, look at what happened when there was the disruption to the pipeline in the United States here. I mean, people in Texas literally ended up freezing to death as a result of that.
Yeah, that's a great example of Texas not having strong enough infrastructure, where you saw other regions of the country do have an infrastructure with different pipelines, where Texas has its own grid, and then they don't put a lot of the resources enough in that. And same with companies. It's a great example with a lot of companies who are basically getting hacked because they don't put enough money and resources into their cybersecurity. So I think cybersecurity is going to be really strong field to get in. I'm actually looking into that as well. The OCC even offers some classes where you could take 10 to 12 classes and you'll be done. You'll get a certificate and you could possibly get a job in that field.
Yeah, that is an important field, no doubt about it. And actually, I was just reading something the other day about how technology has really been such a boon to companies in terms of reducing the costs that they have to pay. And really, they should have put some of that savings then, rather than just putting it into the pockets of the shareholders, they should have put some of it into creating that infrastructure to protect themselves from cyber attacks. What do you think of that?
Yeah, exactly. It's quite baffling when you look at the amount of regulations out there. We have a lot of regulations. I always try to tell people we need to get out the topic of just the word regulations, which has just become a stigma. It's like a boogeyman where we need to talk about the kinds of regulations, because there could be good regulations. And I think a lot of the regulations out there are very bad, but if we had good regulations that put the interests of the company, the customer, and the nation as a whole is where we need to go. And I was just quite shocked there was not enough regulations out there on cybersecurity for companies. So I really do. I know, for instance, Angus Kane, my favorite senator, he's an independent in Maine. He wants to create legislation. He's a big advocate in getting infrastructure going for cybersecurity, so these companies cannot get attacked. And if they do get attacked and they don't put enough resources, man, this could ruin our economy. So this is something we really need to start thinking about.
I was interested in what you were saying about regulation here. Now, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think Texas, especially, is a great example of where this kind of anti-regulation attitude has really gone off the rails. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's just a great example of laissez-faire capitalism. Like, look, I don't want to put any businesses, you know, I don't want to close any business down. I don't want any businesses just suffering like that. However, there needs to be some type of regulations out there for our security. And a lot of people squawk at it, but look at regulations have given us seat belts. Regulations have given us safety hazards in our cars. So, look at that Pinto, the Ford Pinto in the 70s, catalytic converters, and the other types of catalytic converters in the years have evolved from the big three, or rather big four companies, because in the 50s you had American Motors. You've seen all these car companies evolve over time with good regulations. And there's a lot of businesses in Texas where they want to deregulate a lot of stuff. You've seen Trump deregulate a lot of the fossil fuel industries, and we could have some catastrophic effects if we're not seeing them now from that. So at the end of the day, we need to have good regulations that don't benefit the corporations, but we ultimately need a separation of corporation and state, where the statesmen, the congressmen, and the legislation should really focus on putting the people first, the economy first, before special interests. That's what we need. It's quite common sense.
Well, what about the whole issue of antitrust? I mean, it seems like right now American industry has become so consolidated that it's impacted pretty much everything. I mean, it's impacted the job market, where we've been able to see employers kind of hold down wages, even when we're dealing with a labor shortage in some circumstances. They don't want to pay higher wages, so because of the fact that there are really no other options, there's no real competition for the workers in a lot of cases. They've been able to hold down wages. So, I mean, do you think that there needs to be more done on the antitrust side?
Yeah, I really do. I think that, for instance, big tech is a great example. How they just have this
Yeah.
huge hold on everything. Google too. We Google 90% of that stuff out there, and then they even basically control what we can see. When everything gets too big, it's not good for anybody. So I'm a strong believer in the antitrust laws. As long as it levels the playing field out, and they could basically undermine and find the flaws that are in them.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a tough situation because of the fact that these businesses, when they become so large and so powerful, then they stand in the way of being able to create these reforms that will try to address this.
Yeah, exactly. And that my type of mindset. I'm always for a reformist. I don't really think ideologically. I think of reform. Like basically, it's stop asking the questions why we got here, which is important, but we should say, what can we do to improve? It's the what that really matters within anything. It's critical thinking, it's problem solving, and making legislations that make a greater impact is coming up with results to ask the
Yeah.
question, what can we do?
Now, what's interesting is that there is legislation going through Congress right now addressing the issue of the monopolistic situation we have going on in big tech. And the irony is that it's supported by both extreme liberals and extreme conservatives. The extreme conservatives, because they believe that somehow it's silencing conservative voices. I mean, we've heard that whole limiting on the culture war and cancel culture, that whole side of things. And then the liberals are concerned because of the fact that it's antitrust. I mean, literally, we've got a situation here where you've got these companies controlling the entire market.
Yeah, in the day, everything's all about the devils in the details. That's what you really need. Everybody needs to sit down, look at the legislation. At the end of the day, as long as it's improving our economy, and protecting our interests as society, where it doesn't benefit corporate interests, where it benefits the peoples, where we really need to look at, where we need to come together and find solutions.
Right, right. Okay, now you said something earlier that I found interesting about how, as a libertarian, you were really kind of opposed to government spending, but you've become more Keynesian. For those who haven't taken my economics classes like you did, Keynes, of course, is the person who advocated government spending to address recessionary environments. So, I mean, we certainly saw a great example of that recently with the spending that the federal government undertook to address the COVID crisis. And it seems like we're starting to bounce back pretty quickly from that now. So do you think that was a good thing that the federal government did? And how do you think that impacted things?
It really did. You look at the COVID relief bills that we had. We only had three. I know in Canada they were doing monthly rebates to
They
the
were.
citizens, and their economy didn't go under. If you look at ours, though, we grew each time. Each time we intervened and gave the money to the people desperately needed during that time, we're still seeing that benefit our society today. So sometimes anything can happen, whether it's a tragedy or a pandemic. There always needs to be some type of backup plan, and I think we could have done more, honestly.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of my libertarian conservative friends would be like, "Oh my gosh, there's so much pork in it, though. There's a lot of hidden stuff." And like, look, yeah, at the end of the day, you're going to get that. However, who benefits the most in the end of the day? And it really benefited the American public. Anybody making less than $80,000 at the time, or who is unemployed, used that money, and that actually pumped it back into the economy. And
Yeah.
especially with wages so stagnant the last 20 years, wages haven't really grown too much. This really shown that we could have more intervention like that. And I know Andrew Yang is a big proponent of the basic universal income, which I think is actually a pretty solid idea. Or we could just get wages back up by raising either the minimum wage, or even, like you said, slight inflation in your other videos. Actually, I agree with you, is an outstanding idea, because that could grow wages all across the platform.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's so much of the economic growth has been concentrated in the very wealthy, and really nobody else has benefited from the economic growth that the United States has experienced over the past 30, 40 years. It's really, the numbers are really quite shocking. Now, one thing that just jumped out at me is what you mentioned about pork, and I'll be the first to say that there is waste in government spending, but I mean, there's waste everywhere. There's waste in corporate spending. There's, in fact, it's funny, when I was teaching a business class not too long ago with a bunch of MBA students who were all returning students, they were talking about how wasteful government is. And I asked them, well, are any of you going to say that your employer has no waste? And all of them kind of laughed because they realized, well, yeah, of course there's waste in our companies. I mean, there's waste in my own household budget, for crying out loud. But that being said, so much of the time when we talk about pork, it's spending that benefits someone else. Like they talk about, welfare spending could be something that's so wasteful, and yet so many people might rely upon it for just being able to put food on the table.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we don't talk about this type of waste where, what is it, 59, 60% of our discretionary spending always goes to the military. And how much waste
Yeah,
is in
right.
that? We
Yeah.
have so much ships, unused warships, war tanks, and other types of even obsolete stuff still being built just because there's
Yeah.
contracts where people profit off of. So we need to really look at that. Even the Pentagon has even come out and said, even during President Obama, who didn't
Yeah.
spend as much on the defense quite as much he did, he actually did spend a lot. It's a quite a
Yep.
self-fulfilling prophecy when the conservatives say he cut military spending, when the Pentagon at the time even said, we could get this even lower. And yet it's increased under Trump. I know it's going to increase even or stay the same probably around Biden, because at the end of the day, that's who writes these guys checks out and controls Washington, sad to say. So hopefully one day in my lifetime, I could see some type of change where we could put more money into infrastructure, more money into education. And I know a lot of conservatives like to say we spend a lot of education and whatnot, but at the end of the day, we actually don't. Certain communities get more education, get more funding than some of the other more poor areas. However, at the end of the day, our priorities are quite backwards in this nation. And all you have to do is study and look at how other governments and societies work in Europe and other democracies. You'll see that they're doing quite well.
Yeah. Well, education too is really an interesting area, especially if you're looking at it when you want to talk about a critique of the libertarian point of view, because education, most funding in the United States is based upon local property taxes, and there's local control of the different school districts, which a lot of people say, oh, that's great because then you've got local involvement, et cetera. But what it ends up doing is it ends up creating winners and losers, where you've got certain districts that have wealthier people with higher property taxes, and as a result of the fact they're able to have better schools, and other areas where property values might not be so high that doesn't have the same kind of revenue, and as a result are unable to provide the same kind of educational opportunities to their students. And so you kind of create this dichotomy, and you see this throughout the United States. We've really created at least a two-tier system, if not a multi-tier system. And in some respects, that's kind of what libertarians are arguing for, isn't it? Where they say, hey, we want everybody to kind of pay for themselves, but aren't they basically saying, hey, we kind of want to take care of our own situation and not worry about anybody else in society?
Exactly right. That's one of the flaws of the thinking, is that you're only thinking about the self or your own best interest. When at the end of the day, collectively, we all share the same nation. We all have the same problem. So at the end of the day, if one community gets less allocation of resources than the other, they're going to suffer, and then therefore society suffers. And that's why we see the type of socioeconomic issues that we're facing today, and it all trickles down from there. So if you look at like a nation like Finland or France, for instance, they every community gets the same amount of resources, and they even have proper school lunches at the it doesn't matter what school district you're in, all the kids eat really well during the school. There's proper nutrition, and they also make education more fun. There's not as much standardized testing in there, and the classrooms are more fun. They're more active with the students. The teachers get to interact with the students more. It's more of a liberating type of experience for the students. So therefore, they end up increasing education. That's why you see a country like Denmark and Finland top tier, where we're now like 25th, 26th. We're trapped in that when it used to be in the top 5.
Yeah, they have, I was just going to say, and they have better outcomes than we do, actually.
Yes.
And this is something really that benefits all of society. I mean, we can see the direct impact, for example, of the GI Bill and kind of the education that was provided to so many Americans who served in the military going through college at that point, and even some into graduate school, and the incredible positive impact that it had on the growth of our country overall in the 50s and 60s, right?
Oh, yes, it's exactly, right. At the end of the day, that's a great piece of legislation that's proven to work, while flawed though too. If you look at the history, sadly, a lot of the black soldiers were not able to get that,
It's
but
true.
and then that's one thing that they want to suppress and whitewash as well. And when you're the topic of critical race theory, it's really end of the day trying to whitewash history. So that's quite alarming. But at the end of the day, it was a very fine piece of legislation. Like, look, libertarians like to argue that government's ineffective on all levels when that's a great piece of legislation that shows that it does work. Look at the Hoover Dam, look at NASA, look at Social Security could work, even though that's been cut. But that there's some great programs, and I hate the broad term of socialism all the time. It's just this boogeyman name. Now we're hearing communism. We hear Marjorie Taylor Greene use that type of word, and they do even really know what this means. We have socialized stuff in our country now, so it becomes really a broad term where people don't really understand the terms, and if they do more research, they'll find that it's just really a scare tactic that's been around for, my gosh, the last 120 years, ever since the
Yeah.
Bolshevik Revolution. Rather, we started hearing about these alarming terms.
Yeah. And, that's a great point that you make, because there are so many things that are used to scare people. And a great example was when you were talking earlier about, excuse me, about countries like Finland and Norway and France. And one example, too, that I hear all the time is Canada. Oh, we don't want to have socialized medicine because look at how things are in Canada. Well, most Canadians love their healthcare system and would never exchange it for anything, right? And similarly, when you look at the economics of Finland and Norway and France and Canada, in many cases, they grow as well, if not better than the United States, and certainly have better outcomes than we do on a number of measures. So, I mean, are those really fair attacks to be made against efforts to try to expand the safety net?
Well, that's exactly right. They like to pinpoint and use the Soviet Russia or Fidel Castro's type of thing, what they end up confusing it with is authoritarianism. That's what it is, because those just happen to be left-wing ideologues that ended up becoming authoritarian, and it was not healthy. We all reject authoritarianism, whether it's coming from the left or the right. Ultimately, you point to great examples. Yeah, the healthcare is quite well. Look at Cuba, even how authoritarian they are, which is all that's bad stuff. But if you look at one issue, they're some of the world's lead researcher in vaccines. In fact, they have a very effective COVID vaccine, I guess. Did you read about that?
Yeah. Yeah, they do, and actually, their outcomes on in education, their outcomes in healthcare, their outcomes in so many levels in dealing with crime and drugs are much better than ours on a number of measures, actually. But you mentioned authoritarianism here, but are you concerned then about the type of movement that you're seeing within the Republican Party? I mean, last I saw something like 26% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who lost the election by 7 million votes, for crying out loud. And there's really been so many investigations into this, and all have found that there is no evidence of any kind of fraud that occurred. And in fact, where there has been prosecution of fraud, it's basically been the Republicans who committed it. But yet there's this attitude now that's developing on the Republican side of, if we don't win, then the election was stolen. And isn't that just a prescription for authoritarianism then?
Oh, it is. If you look at any type of nation without history, it always begins with conspiracy theories, baseless conspiracy theories, whether it's Nazi Germany, basically blaming everything, having this conspiracy that the Jewish people had this one world plot against the white people, and then it led to a lot of grievances within German society and the white race at the time. We're actually seeing shades of that now, which is quite eerie. I just saw a video, and now this video, where there were town halls at schools where families throwing a fit about critical race theory and about transgender rights in school, and they're basically turning it around and saying this is how Hitler and Goebbels got into power, because of propaganda like this, while they're spewing this white grievance propaganda that echoes Nazi Germany. And if anything, if you look at the Nazi Germany and their enemies at the time, they very much hated the left. They really hated the socialists, communists, as well as feminists at the time. And and they have that hatred now for that type of stuff. Anybody that's a few steps left of them is automatically considered a communist. Like, and if we see this, we've seen this in America throughout our last 100 years as well. Even Eisenhower and JFK were accused of that, but that was really radical at the time, and they were voted out and laughed out in the '64 election with Barry Goldwater and Lyndon B. Johnson. That stuff was very radicalized. American people rejected that, but now with the amount of propaganda with Fox News and InfoWars and many other YouTube platforms and podcasters, they really radicalize the conservative movement. It's not even really about policies. It's all just about vilifying the other side. It's all about demagoguery and fear.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, are they even really following conservative policies for that matter? I mean, we hear this almost reverence now for Russia and for Putin. I mean, is this the same conservative movement that Ronald Reagan stood for back in the 1980s?
Oh, Michael, it's not even the same conservative movement under Bush and Cheney.
Yeah,
they're really regressing, and even George W. Bush basically rejects this type of movement that's going on in the conservative part, the Republican Party today.
Yeah, for sure. So you were telling me earlier about your current work, and could you just describe for our viewers what you do now?
Yes, I work in logistics under XPO, which we're contracted with General Motors. It's really a great company. We're seeing a lot of supply chain issues from COVID, a lot of supply shortages, but we're really trying to get the material into the hands of the facilities, work with suppliers to get the parts moving, to prioritize parts so we could get our economy back going, because at the end of the day, that's a lot of our transportation relies on that.
Yeah, for sure. And you said something else interesting too, which is that some of the suppliers were having trouble finding employees. And what did they end up doing to address that?
Yes, it's actually they're raising wages
they raised wages, and what happened then?
An increase in labor.
Imagine that. Yes, exactly right. The market worked. So that's the thing that's frustrating here, which is that you have this effort by employers to try to literally hold down wages, even when the market works. And it's kind of this double standard that we see so often, which is that the market's great when the wealthy are benefiting, but when the wealthy suddenly are under pressure for one reason or another, suddenly they want bailouts and they want protections from the government. Do you think that's true?
Oh yeah, I think it's quite grotesque what we've seen the last year. We've seen the working class, the struggling people that were out working during COVID. Like myself, I was working in the retail before this job, and I couldn't endure it anymore. I couldn't handle the mistreatment. People were listening to Fox News propaganda and starting to become anti-mask, anti-science, and even coworkers doing that. It just didn't feel safe. It was very unprofessional. So I ended up finding a great job like this, which ended up being a remote job. And let me tell you, COVID seriously, that they're very much a professional company that I really embrace, and I wish more companies like that. But the previous job that I had before was in automotive retail. They weren't as concerned about it. They had policies, but they weren't enforced as well. It ended up becoming quite laissez-faire. But to answer your question, the whole year we've seen this whole demonization of workers wanting higher wages, or people being labeled as too lazy because they're a little reluctant to get back into work, or they just want to collect the $300, which is such a fallacy into the day, because Missouri, was it the state of Missouri who ended up cutting the $300, and there's not been an increase in labor.
Didn't make a difference. Exactly right. Yeah, there was just a study out on that. I was going to point out in another video. You're absolutely right about that.
Yes.
So no, they seem to think that it's more because of people dropping out of the labor force because they are retiring, saying, hey, I like being off now. I was close to retirement anyway. Or people having trouble now rearranging daycare since a lot of the daycare facilities have closed. Or frankly, people just being afraid to go back, which is hard to blame them, isn't it?
Oh yeah, like I'll never go back to retail, even if COVID's completely contained. I wouldn't want to go back to that job. What COVID did for me is it revealed the fabric of a lot of things. It revealed our fabric and a lot of people's human nature. And this is a virus. We should have been all in this together. And sadly, it was politicized, where people were pit against each other, all because of what they were hearing with conspiracy theories, or on Fox News, or even President Trump at the time could have won re-election so easy had he just took the virus more seriously. There was that one week, Mike, if you remember, he was taking it seriously, and I was rooting for him. We all were. And then all of a sudden that all went away because he was listening to Steve Miller. Steve Miller gets his information from InfoWars. So you could see all that stuff trickled down into the administration, and it just became disastrous after that.
That is really true. I mean, that's one of the things that's most shocking when I think people will look back on 2020, which is that there was a period there where actually Trump could have been reelected. He could have been the hero, much the way that, say, George Bush was or George W. Bush after 9/11, or George Bush, for that matter, after the invasion of Kuwait. That when people rally around the president when there's a crisis and the president shows leadership, and people were willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt and give him the opportunity to do that, and he just really dropped the ball in that whole situation, didn't he?
Oh, he really did. There was actually one week where I was liking what he said. I put all my differences aside, my agreements to the side. I'm like, I want to root for him. And even Mike Pence at one time, they're like, oh, I like that. Or they're saying what we need to hear. They're taking it serious. It's professional. I was able to put all that stuff away. We're in a crisis. Then sure enough, we started seeing everything become politicized. We saw the CDC completely get undermined. And a lot of people don't trust the CDC now, but because it comes to administration, if you do your research, they completely undermined it and sidelined it.
Yeah, which is crazy. I mean, just the fact that the issue of wearing masks is something that's political. I saw an interesting cartoon the other day where they were saying, I want to keep wearing masks, not because I'm afraid of getting the virus because I've been vaccinated, but I want to keep wearing it because I'm afraid people will think I'm a Republican. And it's kind of funny, but it's also sad that something like wearing masks, which is a protection not just for you, but for everybody, is something that's political. Most countries look at us like this and they can't believe that this is an issue.
Oh, I know. We're the only nation in the world that had this type of controversy with masks, where even Japan didn't even need mandates because it was the proper thing to do. Everybody there did it. And here, for whatever reason, because there was a lot of power at stake, and God forbid if Democrats and Republicans come together on anything, not even on something as simplistic as wearing a mask, or something as common sense as wearing a simple mask to protect someone else.
Yeah, well, I think that the miscalculation, though, that Trump made was he thought that somehow by pretending that the virus didn't exist, that people wouldn't pay attention to it, that making it seem like it was no big deal. And the problem was, it was a big deal. No matter how he cut it, people knew that it was a big deal, and people were getting sick, and people knew people who died and had seen it. So there was no way for him to kind of paper this over and pretend that it wasn't there. But he just viewed it as kind of an inconvenience and something that was getting in the way of his reelection, when really he should have put that aside and should have treated it as a crisis and handled it. And frankly, I think had he done it, and I guess thank goodness that it didn't work out that way in some respects, but had he done that, he probably would have been reelected, probably by a large margin.
Oh yeah, he absolutely would have. If he would have put it on each time, talk about the importance of it, talk about how we need to come together. He helped push Congress to act on national emergency sales tax, where we saw so many companies profit off the pandemic who didn't end up paying anything. Imagine if that money went to the small business owners, because we saw a lot of people didn't like the lockdowns last year. They were fairly unpopular only because they weren't handled right, where economically weren't handled right. Imagine if we had a national emergency sales tax on Amazon or Walmart, where we allowed that money to go to the places that were forced to shut down, like bars and restaurants. Nobody would be complaining if that was the case.
Yeah, I agree. And you really can't help but sympathize with small business owners, because I mean, I used to be a small business owner, and I can only imagine what it would be like if my business were literally shut down as a result of this virus out there. And I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know what I would have done. How do you pay the bills? Because the bills keep coming in even when you're not working. But when you're not working, you're not generating revenue. So how do you pay those bills? So I can totally sympathize with how those people were feeling. But by the same token, didn't we as society as a whole owe them something to try to protect them while, as you say, certain businesses were doing great? I mean, the grocery stores, for example, Amazon, some of the streaming services. There are so many examples of organizations that, while there were certain ones that suffered, like in the travel industry or the hospitality industry, there are others that really just benefited from the crisis.
Yeah, exactly right. And if we had a plan, that's the thing, we never had a national emergency plan under Trump, and even states were competing for PPE, which was quite tragic. But there was,
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
yeah, we needed to have the national emergency plan on an economic level and on a medical level, health medical. And we just didn't get it from that administration, and it just led to a lot of this divide and conquer. Where it was complete despotism, is what we saw last year. So if we had a functional democracy where we thought more democratically as a society as a whole, we would have saw more effective results.
Right, right. Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, it's a sad state of affairs, unfortunately. But fortunately, things seem to be going a little bit better now. So how do you think that Biden's doing so far?
Well, Biden did outstanding, I feel, with the vaccines, and that's another thing. Trump spent a whole month on the big lie, campaigning
Yeah,
on the big lie, putting his own interests over the health of other people. Imagine how many people went and got sick or been hospitalized or sadly even died, because we had a record deaths in January and February with COVID, I do believe. And
yeah.
if you looked at, if he would have got the vaccine rollout even quicker, imagine how many people would have been saved for that. And he did really great with that. I'm kind of lukewarm on Biden's foreign policy. I'm happy about the Afghanistan thing. I'm kind of worried about getting involved with other nations. I do like how he is tougher on Putin, although stronger than Trump with that handling of that nation. And like looking at the day, Biden was not my top choice, but I hate to say
Mine
this.
neither,
Yeah,
but
lesser of the two evils, as you if you go,
yeah,
we had to do that. I found myself voting Democrat for the first time since the 2000s with Biden, but at least he's got a strong character. He's got strong character. Seems like to be a principled man, and
yeah.
he's not a reactionary, which is good. And I also like the fact that he is willing to work on infrastructure. Like he really puts infrastructure and science first, almost like Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a
Yeah,
great president because he really cared about infrastructure and science, and that's
right.
some great qualities about President Biden.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you know, it's funny you mentioned the character issue, and I remember the way that Republicans beat the crap out of Democrats over character, and certainly, you know, frankly, we probably deserved it with the way the Clintons behaved in some respects. But by the same token, though, here they are, the same people who were attacking the Clintons because of the fact that they didn't have good character, defending Donald Trump. I mean, what's that all about?
Yeah, Donald Trump has just become a cult figure, really. In the end of the day,
Yeah,
he was this rock star of the Republican Party. Now he's starting to look like the washed up rock star that doesn't need to go on tour anymore. And the Republican Party, if that's all they have, they're going to lose more elections in the day. They have
yeah.
no policies. I do not understand how they're going to win 2022. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, they're going to win." The only reason that they do win the House is because they redistrict. I cannot see them winning the Senate, though. There's just no possible way. And
That's the scary thing, though. I mean, they could win the House just simply because of gerrymandering and redistricting and everything, and that's part of why they're blocking, you know, some type of reform going through Congress that would address that.
yeah, there's a huge war in democracy right now. It's just so tragic. Where we saw record turnouts last year, we should be embracing that. We've always talked about we want more people to participate in society, and last year we did. A lot of people were able to get were informed last year. They had more time to research. They were more politically involved than any time since my lifetime in U.S. politics. We had record turnouts as well, even under two candidates that people didn't really like, but that just shows that we need a democracy. Now they're going and drafting all this legislation. It's just quite alarming what they're doing, and hopefully we could stop some of this stuff on a Supreme Court level. But we saw that decision the other day, and it didn't go
Yeah, the
through.
Supreme Court has basically taken the position that they're going to allow the states to do whatever they want in terms of making it harder to vote. I mean, the Supreme Court really has been such a disappointment to me. Yes, there have been certain decisions where it seems like they have kind of taken a position that really doesn't seem conservative, you know, kind of surprising, you know, especially when it comes to things like, say, gay rights, for example. But yet, when it comes to kind of the hardcore partisan issues, they've really shown themselves for what they are, which is, we have to remember, Barrett, Kavanaugh, um, Gorsuch, all these guys, they were partisan warriors in the Republican Party. Even the Chief Justice, and they have never put down the mantle there. Yes, they certainly kind of look out on the broader issue for the credibility of the Supreme Court, at least. But by the same token, when it comes to the kind of taking a partisan position to protect the Republican Party against any kind of criticism or any kind of attack, they've been there defending it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And a lot of people like to point to, well, America never was a democracy. It's almost that's a good thing, but really, you're right. It never was a democracy, but that doesn't mean it's good. It's not a good
Right.
thing. And we saw America was founded was basically just for, slave owners that were white. The black people weren't able to participate at the time. Women weren't. We certainly evolved during that over the time, but now I feel like we're regressing. We're in this area where things were moving forward, even last year with record turnout and voting. So what's the solution? In the day, we just need to have a more informed populace, and we need to really get the word out with what you're doing with your YouTube channel. The odds are stacked against us right now. A lot of people like to say, "Oh, everything's liberal. The mainstream media is liberal and stuff like that." Well, look at how much propaganda is out there on the right. You have Fox News, you have Infowars, and you have all these other outlets out there on a grassroots level. They get so much dark money, and there's so many. They're even co-opting the youth right now with people like Ben Shapiro or a few other podcasters around their age group, like what's like Charlie Kirk's name? He's young. Then you have Candace Owens trying to get Black Americans on board on her side. So there's all this propaganda out there that tries to weaponize their opponent by spreading false information.
Yeah, that's the thing that I don't understand. They talk about the media being liberal, and yet I think that there's really no way that you could argue that the things like the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN at least are making an effort to try to be accurate and and provide accurate information. Even some elements within Fox News are, but some of these other organizations like AON and Infowars and some of the others, I mean, they don't even pretend to be factual. I mean, they don't care, and yet somehow they're the conservative orthodoxy, and anything that's factual is viewed as liberal. I mean, I don't get that.
Oh, exactly right. Even if you point out a study now, they're like, "Oh, that's just a liberal study now," or "Science is just liberal." It's just, end of the day, there's certainly biases with the major networks, absolutely, but they try to correct it. New
Yeah.
York Times, CNN, if they do make an error, they will, certainly correct it. You'll never see any of that on these newer platforms at all.
Right, for sure. And the thing that just shocks me, and you saw this on Fox News as well, is where you'd have them echoing a Trump position one day, and then he changed his position, which he did frequently, and they just follow along with him, and as if it never changed. I mean, it's like in 1984 where they talk about, oh, this is the truth and this is the way it's always been,
Right.
totally ignoring the history there. And you're right. I mean, at least the New York Times and some of the others, they will make mistakes, but then they'll correct them. And the irony is then they get attacked because they correct them. They say, oh, you see, there, it just shows that they get things wrong. Well, they admit they get things wrong. Everybody gets things wrong. But the fact that they're admitting them and trying to move forward with being correct, that is something that you don't see in these other, if you could call them, journalism sources.
Oh yeah, we're in a time right now where everything's double speak. There's so much double speak on there that Orwell warned about, or even the term double speak and Orwellian has been co-opted by these guys. I'm like, well, have you read 1984? Did you understand that Orwell actually was a left-wing socialist? And they try to take his ideas and say, look at the Biden and the left are all authoritarian. And there's a lot of confusion out there. Like, we've seen years of bad policies by the Democrats with the Republicans. The true establishment is the establishment that wants to keep the drug war going. It wants to keep the endless wars going on, the military.
The Washington crowd.
Yeah, the Washington crowd.
That they're there and they want to stay there. And they've kind of forgotten that there's a country, across the United States.
Right.
And the problem is, though, that that kind of insulation has created kind of two reactions to it. On the one is the left, where you see things like Occupy Wall Street, kind of this understanding of kind of the closeness of the corporate interests and the Washington elite being something that needs to be addressed. But then on the right, you see it where they also feel that they've been dispossessed, but rather than blaming the people who really are deserving of blame. They're kind of buying this line of, oh, we need to attack immigrants, or we need to attack the Chinese, or we need to attack even, African Americans. I mean, let's face it.
Well, yeah, we've even seen the right use populism now and use the word like Tucker Carlson, where it says the ruling elite, as if he's not part of it,
Really?
advocating for it. Because the ruling elite for since the Nixon days, we've had tax cuts being advocated and tax cut after tax cut that's blew up our deficits. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of confusion right there who the real enemy is. And again, it's just as a prime example of despotism. If we all came together and put the interests of our fellow neighbor and our fellow society, we'd come together, we could squash the true ruling class of the billionaires who put the interests of the people of themselves over the people.
For sure, for sure. Well, I'll tell you what, we've had a good conversation. I really enjoyed it, but let's talk a little bit closer to home for you, I guess. And you're a filmmaker, as I mentioned earlier. And I loved your movie, Blood Immortal. And you have another movie out there that I hadn't seen, actually, The Girl on the Mat. Am I right about that?
Yes, it's my short film, The Girl on the Mat. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. But Blood Immortal is available for people to view. Am I right about that?
Yes, you could find it on Amazon Prime. It's also on Tubi for free. You can watch it on Amazon Prime without the commercial or ads. But if you want to watch it with the ads, you could watch it for free on Tubi as well. And it's also available to buy on DVD at Best Buy and Walmart and Barnes and Nobles and whatnot. So.
Yeah, and you made kind of a really interesting analogy in this movie, kind of almost talking about the need that the vampires had for blood as like one of those limited resources, and how it gets allocated. Then that says a lot about our society, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. The blood was certainly used as a metaphor in that film, as a necessity, almost like the dollar. And I put money intertwined with the blood in the film. That's really what it serves as, and how greedy and individualistic it could cause. And I use a lot of cautionary ideas about rampant individualism that we saw so much last year with the pandemic, that the film is quite timely today. Looking at the film when I made it 3 years ago, I was like, wow, this is still relevant. So hoping in the years to come, it has that timeless quality to it.
Yeah, very much so. And I love how you're able to kind of combine an important message with really a very entertaining movie. I have to say, my whole family watched. We all enjoyed it. And you had a great performance. I'm trying to remember the name of the actor who you had in it.
Rick Mason.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
He was fantastic, and as was the whole cast. But he's just one of the actors who I think some of our viewers might also be aware of. And so you've really made a fantastic movie, frankly, that I think more people should see. And from what you said earlier, you're actually working on another project. Am I right about that?
That's correct. My sophomore feature film is titled Phantom Moon. We're currently in pre-production on that film. We hope to hopefully shoot that this year or early next year, depending how financing goes. The financing is always the toughest part. We have a lot bigger budget this time than Blood Immortal. And
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, we got some, I can't disclose the names yet, but we do have some names attached to the movie. Well, actually, I can say Peter Green signed on. He was Zed in Pulp Fiction, and he was also the villain in the Mask, very iconic actor. He was in the independent movie Clean Shaven from the 90s as well. Very familiar face. If you look him up, you're like, oh yeah, I know him. And we have a couple other actors which we hope to announce to officially sign on by hopefully next week. Dealing with agents is quite challenging. I was just listening to Joe Rogan. Yeah, I was listening to Joe Rogan with Tarantino, and even Tarantino has issues with agents. So it's just the nature of the game.
Yeah, well, who knows? Maybe with the path you're on, you could well be the next guy who Joe Rogan's interviewing to talk about his movies. So,
well, I sure hope so, because Tarantino's going to retire after the 10th movie, he says.
Oh, is that right? I didn't hear that. Okay, well, that's kind of a disappointment. I must admit to being a Tarantino fan.
Yeah.
So, although I was a little disappointed with his last picture, but we'll see. We'll see. Something tells me he'll be able to bounce back. All right. Well, let's kind of just remembering back to when I had you in class. Let's take just kind of go off topic here right now, and let me just ask you a few kind of unrelated questions here. So, in the last year, what's your favorite movie that you've seen that people should go out and see?
My favorite movie of 2020 was Nomadland, directed by Chloe Zhao. Won Best Picture. I know some people like to beat that movie up because it's quite depressing and nobody watched the Oscars. I heard all that stuff, but end of the day, it's a really a great film. If anything, you should watch that film. With what we dealt with during the pandemic, it's quite a liberating film experience. It kind of shows the value of life and how we really need to get in touch with our mind and spirit more. And Frances McDormand's quite terrific as well. So No Man Land was my favorite film of last year. I also love Promising Young Woman, which is a terrific movie starring Carey Mulligan, a great Me Too revenge drama. And Never Really, Sometimes Always is a great film too. That was a Sundance gem out of last year, right before the pandemic. That film was getting a lot of buzz, and then it was released on the streaming platform of Amazon Prime. But that was one of my favorite films of the year as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, and who's your favorite director who's working right now?
Oh, geez, that's a loaded question. There's probably three. I'm going to say like a tie of like three. It's going to be
Okay.
Quentin Tarantino, David Lynch, and Sofia Coppola. It'd be my three favorite living filmmakers today.
Three great choices for sure. And any movies coming up that you're looking forward to in particular?
Oh yes, P.T. Anderson's got a new film coming out. He's one of my favorite directors as well. The director of Magnolia and There Will Be Blood. He's got a new film called Soggy Bottom, which is supposed to be a '70s period piece which we know P.T. Anderson's no stranger to '70s period pieces with Boogie Nights and Inherent Vice. But I'm hoping it's more like Boogie Nights than Inherent Vice. But it stars Bradley Cooper, so I'm really looking forward to that. It's slated to come out in November or December. I'm sure that will be a big Oscar contender. Most P.T. Anderson movies are, and I know Sean Baker's got a new film coming out at the Cannes Film Festival. He's the director of Tangerine and the Florida Project, and he's one of the great up and coming directors that I like as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. Part of the reason I ask is you actually do movie reviews too, don't you?
Yes, I have a website called defactofilmreviews.com. They've been published before in the Oakland Press, but you could go check out my film reviews on defactofilmreviews.com. Each week we have new reviews up. You could check and see our lists as well. We have podcasts, and you could look in. We use a 4-star rating system as a homage to Roger Ebert, and we get a lot of compliments on our sites because we write differently than most critics. So what we do is we really find the nuts and bolts. We really break it down and give a very honest and erudite analysis of the movie that almost feels academic.
Yeah, well, I love your reviews, and I definitely have gone to your website more than once to check them out. So,
thank you.
So I hopefully other people will start checking that out, and maybe some more people will check out Blood Immortal, and hope we'll be looking forward to then your next picture on its way. And what's it called again?
Phantom Moon.
Phantom Moon. Okay, well, that's definitely something for us to look forward to. Well, on that, I guess I will say have a great rest of your 4th of July weekend. It's been great having you here, and happy 4th of July to all our viewers, by the way. Hope we'll try to keep in touch in the future. Maybe we'll have you back on when we have more to talk about. It's been a lot of fun having you back on, both as a former student and as somebody whose views I respect. So it's great to have you joining me here, and I'm sure that all of our viewers will appreciate it as well.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, take care, Rob. Thank you. In a pair of decisions released today, the Supreme Court has shown itself to be nothing more than a partisan tool of the right wing. Let's talk about in today's video. I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel and click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So what's especially notable about the two decisions that were released today is, number one, that they use the exact opposite logic to arrive at the conclusions that they arrived at, which of course are the partisan conclusions that the right wing wanted the Supreme Court to reach. And number two, how they are in direct contradiction of an earlier decision that the same Supreme Court had made. So the first case at issue, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, which is the one that's gotten the most attention, refused to strike down laws that were passed in Arizona that make it harder for people to vote, which are especially targeted at minority groups. What's notable about this case is it relies on the balancing act that courts will frequently rely upon, where on the one hand it looks at the burden upon the state, and on the other hand looks at the burden upon the individual rights. So on the one hand, the court says that the fear that the state is trying to address is election fraud, something that is virtually non-existent and which the states couldn't show there was any evidence existed. On the other hand is the burden upon the individual voting rights of the citizens, particularly those who are people of color. Now, interestingly enough, the evidence of the burden of this law being particularly felt by people of color is overwhelming. There's really no question about it. Did the Supreme Court, though, weigh that evenly? Well, really not. Basically, what the Supreme Court said is that it doesn't matter how much evidence you have that this law is placing an unequal burden upon people of color. Literally, there has to be an effort by the state to deny them the right to vote entirely. So if you provide them with any way that they can vote in any way, shape, or form, then that still does not violate the law. Now, this law, combined with an earlier case that dealt with labor unions, shows that the Supreme Court is basically pursuing the conservative wish list when it comes to disempowering anybody who is not in the white conservative elite. So even though there were some surprises and people are saying, oh, the court isn't as conservative as what was expected, the truth of the matter is when it comes to what really matters, which is power within the United States, the court is consistently handing power to the white conservative elite to the expense of everybody else. Now, the second relevant case is Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta. This is a case basically brought by the Koch brothers that argues that charities should not have to disclose who their donors are. Now, that might seem like a fairly innocuous decision, but the place that it becomes an issue is that many of the charities now are being used for political work. And in fact, you could even take the step further, where other kinds of tax entities or tax-free entities are being used for political work. We hear about the super PACs, for example, and donors do not have to be disclosed in those. Now, the irony of this case is that the author of the decision is Chief Justice Roberts. And in an earlier decision, the Citizens United decision, Roberts has said that, oh, the solution to this issue of campaign finance is more disclosure, that you should have to disclose who the donors are. And yet with this case now, just a few years later, he says that charities don't need to disclose who their donors are. So which is it, Justice Roberts? And this is similar to the situation with the Brnovich case, where in an earlier case on voting rights, Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court said, oh, you know, the way that you need to deal with these issues of racially targeting certain groups to impose voting restrictions is to sue under Section 2. Well, under this case now, basically the court says that, oh, you know, under Section 2, we're going to make the burden so high that it's going to be virtually impossible to succeed in these cases. So again, the court is basically taking an earlier recommendation, basically softening a decision that was very harsh, and now saying, oh, but that remedy that we've offered you, well, we're going to take that away too. What's especially disturbing about these two cases and demonstrates how partisan this court has become, and it's not really a neutral arbiter of the law, is how the logic of the two cases literally are the opposite of each other. According to the court, the reason that it struck down the requirement for donor disclosure is that it was too broad, that it addressed a narrow problem, that there was a little problem that was addressed with a very broad response, and the state should narrowly tailor its responses to deal with narrow problems. That's essentially what the court said. On the other hand, in the Brnovich case on voting rights, the court said that despite the fact that there's virtually no evidence of electoral fraud anywhere in the country, that state interest is enough of an interest that literally they can take these broad-based restrictions on voting and apply them. One court had characterized these attacks on voting rights as taking a sledgehammer to a glass table. And that's basically what they're doing. They're completely upending the system to deal with a problem that is really non-existent. So what do these decisions have in common? They have in common that they delivered the result that the conservatives wanted, and that is to take power away from people of color and their supporters and to give it to the white conservatives who are increasingly a minority in this country. Up until now, what has protected the court from an action to expand it or to reduce its powers has been this sense that it is this neutral arbiter of the law, that somehow it is above the partisan battling that's going on. Well, with these two cases, the court demonstrated that that is not the case. The court is nothing more than a legislative body that steps in and changes the law where it believes it's necessary. Remember, these judges are unelected. These judges are not part of a democratic process. They're given lifetime appointments, and as Mitch McConnell demonstrated, you can manipulate the process to make sure that your party gets the nominations rather than sharing it equally between the two parties. If the court is going to act like a partisan legislative body, basically stepping in and legislating, changing law where Congress had set the law, and it's important to note, in these two decisions, basically, the court is stepping into an area where legislature, in the case of the Americans for Prosperity case, the California legislature, and in the case of Brnovich, Congress, actually pass laws. The democratically elected bodies pass laws, and Congress steps in and says, no, we're not going to allow them. And the basis for the argument against them is not a constitutional basis. Basically, it's a reading of the legislative language. And this reading of the legislative language is directly contradictory to what the legislature stated was the intent of the laws. So the point is, if the Supreme Court is going to act like a partisan legislative body, we should treat it as such. And all that deference that we've given to it, where we've said, oh, we need to protect its ability to state the law, all that needs to be wiped clean, and Supreme Court process needs to be changed so that it reflects a more democratic process. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to hear your comments down below. If you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, that'd be a big help. I'll see you in the next video, and in the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.